Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 8 of Blue Leadership with your host, Dennis Nair. Dennis is a 25-year law enforcement veteran and retired chief from the state of New York. He's also a proud graduate of the 240th session of the FBI National Academy and the 61st session of the FBI Leader Command Institute. The Blue Leadership video podcast is brought to you by the nationally ranked Master of Science in Law Enforcement and Public Safety Leadership Program at the University of San Diego. You can learn more about the LEPSL program at criminaljustice.sandiego.edu. And with that, I will kick things over to your host to introduce our featured guest. Thank you, everyone.
Kylie, thank you. And as always, great to be here. And today our guest is going to be Chief Kris Alison from the Central Point, Oregon Police Department. Chief Alison is a 29-year law enforcement veteran. She's been with the Oregon State Police, City of Phoenix, Oregon, City of Lincoln City, Oregon. And now she's in her 10th year as the police chief, which is unheard of in these times. It's normal police chiefs are maybe 18 months to 2 to 3 years. And she's now 10 years as the police chief of Central Point, Oregon. So Chief Allison, thank you so much for being here.
Dennis, thank you for having me.
And one of the things we're really going to talk about, in addition, just a couple other things. Chief Allison is a FBI National Academy graduate. She has a Master of Science degree in criminal justice and her bachelor's degree in criminal justice. So she's also an academic instructor. And one of the best things is when someone who has the experience and the academics can combine those. And in the last 18 months, she's definitely had to do that, because everything that the world has experienced with the pandemic and police civil unrest and policing reforms, she's had to experience. And my first question really is, Chief Allison, can you just talk a little bit about the challenges you and your agency has had and experienced over the last 18 months?
I can. And I'm kind of going to talk to, there were a series of events that has happened over these last 18 months. And when we talk about unprecedented, that's now a buzzword, because I don't even think it describes what law enforcement was faced with in these times. And I'm actually going to add one on that, again, we did not anticipate. But let's start with the pandemic. And I think it's sometimes lost when we, even as law enforcement officials, administrators, or officers and staff, is that when this pandemic started to roll out in late February, early March, we really didn't have all the information of what we know now. And that sounds easy to say now, but at that time, we were faced with making a lot of decisions. We didn't know how this was going to affect our officers and our officers' families. We had to still protect communities, and we didn't have the option to work from home. We were going out there day to day, contacting individuals with our social distancing, but even at that point, not knowing exactly what this was going to look like. From an administrator's standpoint, is how are we going to staff? How were we going, if we did have an outbreak in our department, how were we going to make sure that our city was still safe and covered, and all the contingency plans? And then there was also a piece of it of how were we going to lead? How were we going to be there for our staff, our officers, and our community? And we had to hit all of those. As a good leader, you had to be there, and you had to hit all of those points efficiently.
Yeah. And like, I've said so many times that this is something that there was never a playbook for. And as chiefs, we're used to doing things on the fly and adjusting as we go. And actually, as law enforcement in general, we're used to that. But this, again, we were always getting conflicting expectations, and there was limited knowledge. And then what we were doing was really putting our officers in harm's way. And like you said, if you have an epidemic that runs through the department, then how do you meet your mission of public safety? Because if you have no one to respond to calls, you can't. Right. So that's only one aspect. So now your city is about 260 miles from Portland, Oregon, and you're close to Seattle. And obviously those are two major cities who have been in the national spotlight because of the civil unrest that's occurred. Can you talk a little bit about now that dynamic on civil unrest and how you manage that as well?
Yes. So, Portland has been in the news nationally, regionally, and just in our state. One of the interesting dynamics, we were fortunate here. We did have protests. We had peaceful protests here. We didn't have the rioting or those other aspects. But just up the road in Portland, we saw mass damage, and Seattle for that matter. And it really took a toll on our officers. Seeing the nightly demonstrations and the lack of support for the officers in, at least I can talk to Portland. And I think it really made our officers and our staff reevaluate their choice in careers. And I don't say that to be dramatic. I think I was shocked by it also. When coming in and talking with our officers of how much they were looking forward for another 20 years, saying, I don't know if I can do this. And it really was how at least I interpreted it, because I knew what our situation was here in Central Point, and I knew that we did have some protests, but they were peaceful and we didn't experience the same level of violence. They were actually absorbing it vicariously through not only Portland, but nationwide.
Agreed. And we talked offline, and I'm on the East Coast here in New York, and it was the same. And as chiefs, we know that our job is to do everything we can to keep our officers safe, not just physically with the tactics and training, but emotionally and to keep their well-being intact. And with all that was going on, no chief was able to do that, because what the officers were experiencing on such a deep and broad level was doing exactly that, making every officer, even the best officers out there, really reevaluate, is this the profession they want to continue on? Not even talking 20 years, do they want to do another month in it? Right. And so that had to be tough.
Yeah, Dennis, one of the things that I was surprised by when I was getting feedback is, and you may have seen it also, not only was it the officers, but it was the officers' family members, the wives going to work or husbands going to work and having discourse within their break rooms about the significant other being in law enforcement and how it really was taking a toll on their family. And they didn't want to subject their significant others to that because of what they did for a living.
Right. And make no mistake, as we all know, that even though the family member don't actually put on the uniform, they go through that profession just as much as the officer, and they have to, deal and manage those byproducts and those negative ones, especially. And that's where, from a leadership perspective, we try to control for that when, we try to infuse wellness in to policing, and we try to do things to keep our officers that they can go home and be, a strong component within their family. But what was going on in the last 18 months, that wasn't allowing for that. And now let's add one more variable, the spike in crimes. Right. Across the nation, we were seeing it. I was seeing it in my city. I know the larger cities were seeing it, and that was making the news. Were you seeing aspects of that as well?
Property crime. We saw a lot of increase of property crime and person crime. But I would say in our city, we saw a majority of the property crime. But I'm going to interject a couple of things in there that was unique for ours, but doesn't necessarily have to be unique. It's really a lesson in knowing you have to be flexible because you never know what's going to happen. We, during this time, also had legislation passed where they decriminalized. It was a decriminalization of drug offense in our state, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Measure 110, and that also was an interesting dynamic to mixed into these 18 months. So if you aren't familiar with it, what that does is it reduces a small possession of methamphetamine, heroin, LSD to what we would call here in Oregon a violation for a $100 fine, or the option to contact someone in addiction recovery and then have that fee waived. That has had a lot of impacts. for us. In fact, there was just an article that came out in the Oregonian last week of just what that has looked like. But I will tell you, it has decreased a lot of our drug cases, but as we know, our property crime cases have gone through the roof. The other aspect that was central to our city and my location is we had the Alameda fire that came in September of 2020 that went through our valley. We lost 2,600 homes during a pandemic. And then all cities were tasked with relocating. Our city actually hosted the evacuation center for, I think we were open for 90 days. And just having to relocate, there wasn't anyone in the valley who wasn't touched by this. And we were in the throes of the fire where we had fatalities, and it was an interesting dynamic. And again, when you think you are not going to have more things thrown at you, you always will. It was a day in our lives that there was a couple days in my career that I will always highlight. One of them was the death of an officer. The second was that day when those fires started during the pandemic and the civil unrest swept through our valley.
Yeah, so we have pandemic, civil unrest, changes in legislation that make policing more challenging, and crimes going up, and now fires. So this brings us to the perfect question. As a National Academy graduate, as someone who has a Master of Science in Criminal Justice, did those accomplishments and those paths you took toward leadership help you in navigating these 18 months?
Absolutely. And I thought about that. I thought about, okay, what did they do? Because there's so many aspects of having an education. And if you don't get this at the end of the broadcast or throughout this podcast, is that I am a absolutely supporter of education at any level in law enforcement. I think it is essential now. But one of the things that I really focused on is that having these backgrounds, whether it was the FBI Academy, or I had a very structured master's program through Boston University was my alma mater, is having to pivot, having to know, and having the resources to know I can get through this. I've been challenged before, and I can pivot at a notice. And I think while a lot of people may not correlate that, education allowed that to have a broader view of what was going on.
Yeah, I can see that. And, that actually, well, let's talk a little more about that. We're going to get into, for the viewers and listeners, about women in law enforcement leadership, because that's really going to be the crux of some of what we talk about. But I was going to actually ask that question of your thoughts about education. And you just really said it, the value of it at every level, whether someone's a new patrol officer and they've just gotten out of the academy. That's not too soon for them to start working on an advanced education, or if they haven't, gone to, past their associates, maybe this is the time, because I think it creates this growth-oriented mindset. It allows you to be exposed to a lot of different thought processes, and I just think it makes for a more well-rounded and informed officer. And it seems like that's really what you're saying also.
So Dennis, I'll ask you a question really quickly, because this is something that I've seen in my career, and your and my career have paralleled during the same time frame. How many times as an officer or a sergeant or a lieutenant or any of your rank did someone say, well, education doesn't make you a better officer?
Yeah.
I had it so many times, and I said that if you're thinking of just the tactics and those pieces, I can tell you it may not make you your tactical piece, because we aren't doing those types of activities in a lot of these. I'm going to tell you it makes you a greater in-depth officer.
Agreed.
That's what it brings you.
Agreed. And I always thought that, when you pair and combine that academic knowledge with the practical, then you have a good product.
You have an excellent officer then.
Right. And it's not so much that an officer can say, well, I'm going to this in-service training or that in-service training. That's all extremely valuable. I've always been very training centric because you have to be in this ever-changing profession. But I think the officers who go beyond that and look for their own education outside of, the actual in-service, I think it just gives them a tremendous benefit. And I think that's what you've managed to accomplish very clearly.
Yeah, agreed. I like I said, my support staff, my officers, my community service officers, we're fortunate in my city. We actually supplement college classes, and we also reimburse on the other end. I know not all cities do that, but I encourage all of our staff to move forward in their education, because it's something no one can ever take away from you. And it's such an achievement. And it really was those pieces of paper, while they're just pieces of papers, they opened doors for me that never closed.
Right. And I think when all things being equal and two people are vying for a position or a promotion, and then one person has that academic background, the other one doesn't, that's going to be the difference maker. And I think it also just really shows that candidate has the ability to persevere and wants to better themselves and to grow. So, yeah, we completely see that. And what this is a perfect segue for, as a woman in law enforcement and law enforcement leadership, can you just talk a little bit about, right now there's 12% or so, maybe less, of the sworn population of law enforcement that are females, and maybe less than 3% that are in leadership positions. Can you talk about your career? And again, you've held every rank and every title, and how many obstacles you came across, and then how you were able to also defeat those obstacles to be where you're sitting right now?
Yeah, so I get asked that frequently, of questions of looking at the barriers and the things, because through my career, I think even when I started, there was really a push for women in law enforcement. And so I think that we all thought we were, when I was starting, it was very progressive, that it was moving forward. There were definitely barriers in my career. And what the biggest barrier I think that I came across was I didn't know what they were. A lot of times things would be worked behind the back scenes, and you weren't at the table to know what your barriers were. But what I will say is I never held on to my barriers. And when I did realize what they were, if I'll use the same analogy, if a door shut, then I went around and I opened a window, because that's really what you had to do. And to be quite honest with you, I think that everybody has those challenges, and it's who you are to persevere to go open the window or knock down the window and say, you know what, this isn't going to stop me, or I'm going to try to do this a different way. Because my career is definitely a piece of, I did it a different way. I came up through, I was a field training officer. Then I went into investigations, and from investigations, that's when I went into my first leadership role as a lieutenant. And I did make a job. And I know that was a difficult for a lot of individuals in my department. But everyone had said, well, you can't, you'll never be in administration unless you do A, B, and C. And I said, well, I'm going to do A and I'm going to do C. And B isn't going to work for me, because at that time I had a family. And so I have to make arrangements to do that. And one of those things was education to get there.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So last month, and again, we talked a little bit offline, Peggy York, she was the first female deputy police chief for the LAPD. And she died last month. And she was a pioneer in women's law enforcement and women's law enforcement leadership. She started her career in the 60s, and she became a homicide detective. And her and her partner, Helen Kidder, they wound up having the highest clearance rates and confessions And that actually became what was the motivation for Cagney and Lacey, which was that famous TV show in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And I think she broke a lot of barriers. And I think it basically showed that there should be no reason that a woman can't be at the top leadership positions. And it's great, I think, for the listeners and viewers to see and hear you explain that you just didn't let barriers stop you either.
Yeah, I mean, and you really can't. And one of the things that I think is probably what we're facing now is the biggest barriers, and at least what I'm finding with my female officers, is the balance between family, working, shift work, and putting that all together with civil unrest, with a pandemic, childcare. Those things are enormous. And whether people realize it or not, it's generally thrust upon one member of a family who has to make all of those arrangements, whichever person that may be. It's it can tend to be the female, and especially if they're a single mother or individual, it's very difficult to have to maintain those. And so those are the biggest barriers that I'm seeing right now for females in law enforcement. And I chuckle because we talk about the 1960s and we talk about the 70s and even the early 80s as being archaic, but those barriers are still there. I can say, and I had my first child in 2002, and you felt bad for having to leave a department for your FMLA leave. In 2004, I didn't have enough time saved because I had had a child previously, and I didn't have insurance. They didn't keep my insurance. Now, right, wrong, or indifferent, whether FMLA was in place there wasn't much you could do. And so you had to really struggle to figure out how you were going to make this work. And then there was guilt. You were leaving I always had worked night shift or a graveyard. I was leaving my partners alone. Because it was a small city then. You only had 2 or 3 officers on. And so I was leaving them alone for 3 months. There's a lot of guilt that went on with that.
Yeah. And in the first city where I was the chief, I had an officer who called to say that she was going to have to take some time off FMLA because she was having another child and she felt bad. And I stopped her right there and I says, do not feel bad. I says, we have been down before staffing. We will figure it out. You worry about your health and take care of your family. And I think it was just, for me, it was just very good to hear the relief in her voice. And I was thinking that's just every chief should think along those lines, because you never know when you're going to have an officer out because of suspension or injury or sickness, or they just decide to go to another agency. So those you can't control. And if someone's going to be starting their family, every chief out there should be working to do whatever they can to ease that pathway for them, because the last thing they should have to worry about is feeling guilty.
Yeah. One of the things that I took on, I had a friend who was a lieutenant in another agency in another state, and she was past the point of where she had chosen that she would not have a family. And she had said, I always wanted to, but I knew I either had to choose my career and promote, or I could have a family. I couldn't do both. And I thought, wow, that was not ever on the table for me. I was always supported. And I thought, what a hard choice that would be to make. And I've always been a person of leave it better than you found it. And so for all of my officers, I say, you know what? You're with my female officers, you do not worry about FMLA. We cover that. That's what we do. You will be fine. If you need extra time because things happen, we'll take it. If not, come back, but it's all on your terms. And I also do that with our male officers. It's their wives who are going through a lot. Unfortunately, we've had officers who have had fatalities with children in our department, and it's a horrible experience. But the father also goes through these things, and we want to take care of the family unit. And so it's that piece of the experiences that I have that were not terrible, but they were challenges. I wanted to make sure my department and my officers and staff did not have those same barriers.
Yeah, and as we're talking, just from a wellness perspective and from a leadership perspective, it's something that this is a phase two, that being able to do things that from your chief's position affect the wellness in a positive way. And something as simple as assuring someone that, don't worry, we will keep the show running. You take care of yourself, take care of your family. And in 12 weeks or whenever you come back, you'll be welcome back with open arms. And that's huge. And, so we talked about women in policing and leadership. You are part of something called the 30/30 initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say briefly, my understanding it's to increase the law enforcement sworn female population by 30% by 2030. And right now we're like at around 12% or maybe less. Can you expand on that and just tell the listeners and viewers exactly what your main objectives are?
So our department isn't formally a part of that, but I'm very familiar with it. It's a hefty goal, and it is an initiative for law enforcement leaders to really recognize and implement policies that make it attainable for females to actually want to choose a career in law enforcement. One of the things that I think is important to highlight, because we hear a lot about demographics of officers matching their community. We hear a lot of that narrative, a lot of that discussion, and I think it's absolutely spot on. But what I think gets missed is a lot of times we don't look at gender in our departments matching our community, because we generally, as a female, run 51% of a community. That's just where it lies. And we sure do not see that in our departments. And not that I think that will get there. Well, I would hope someday we would get there, but I'm not sure that that's always going to be the case, because you have a lot of personal choices in there. But those are things that we really need to focus on. And what are the barriers? Is it discrimination? Is it family life? Is it what doesn't appeal to law enforcement or for females in law enforcement? Because one of the things I can say is I don't know that I expected law enforcement to be what it was for me. And what I say is it was great for me. I have had an amazing career. I'm very proud of the career I've had. And I do sometimes nod my head and say, why don't we have more females wanting to come into the career? So are we doing enough education of what the great benefits that we have here and how you can really make a difference? I was having this conversation with my one of my younger daughters, and I said, there are things in my career that I know no one else has ever done, that no one else would have had the empathy or the compassion or the steadfastness to be with a victim. I did child abuse investigations for many years. Being there with a victim when maybe the verdict didn't go our way, but being there to help someone through that homicide scenes, to be there, really knowing what maybe a mother or a wife or a husband was going through. Those are things that you generally, as an individual, you don't get to witness, and you sure don't get to be a part of. And those are some of the most impactful things that I've had in my career. Missing children, where we return them. What other career gets to be a part of someone's life like that?
Yeah, the things we get to do are so meaningful. And I think some of the problem is the old stereotypes of that to do this job, you had to be 6'3" and 220 pounds and muscle. And those days, those are long, long gone. You need a cerebral thinking person with good character and compassion and an ability to relate and connect with others. And I've been on scenes where I can tell you that when a female officer came on scene, it lowered the temperature of what was going down, because they just had more of a calming effect. And some of them are some of the most tactical officers I've worked with. So a lot of those misnomers that are out there, they're not true. And that's why I think some people shy away from the profession who would otherwise be great officers. And then I think I'd like to hear your thoughts. I think the way we can help counter that is by the way we recruit. And if we do recruitment videos and if we're doing promotion of our departments, we shouldn't be just advertising the tactical end of things and the side that like you'd see in the movies. It should really be that comforting people, that thinking officer. And I think that's what's going to help draw in more women in law enforcement, because they're a great asset in how they help in their capacity to improve a situation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I completely agree. I have many times having that de-escalation just by the different presence of a female officer. Interestingly enough, male gender, a lot of times I would notice when I was on patrol, they saw me as a mother figure and sometimes would de-escalate. And I could pick up on that immediately, not always, but there were some circumstances, and I definitely used that to de-escalate situations. One of the things that I also think for administrators and chiefs or people in a recruitment role for female officers is not only to look outside your department, but look inside your department and your cities. Because generally, whether it's public works, planning, all of these other areas that you may not think about, those individuals are in public service. And so it was interesting to me because I had some support staff, and I tried to do an interview with my staff once a year, just have a sit down and talk about their goals, talk about what they're doing, where they see themselves. And generally with my support staff, I always ask, do you want to be a police officer? And I was always surprised. Some of them said, well, I didn't think, no one has ever asked. I didn't think I could do that. And I'm like, of course you can. Of course, why couldn't you? Or ask other people who maybe were in public works, and I'm like, have you ever thought, if I saw the traits of someone who would work well in my department, I would say, have you ever thought about being a police officer? And they were like, well, no one, I didn't think I could. I'm like, well, why can't you? Right. And we've recruited some of those individuals, and I think that that's important to not leave the people who are right there sitting next to you out because they just have never been asked or they never thought about it in that context.
Right. And again, we keep circling back to leadership, and that's a pure leadership of really understanding to reach out to those who, because as a police chief, just from your experiences, not only who's going to be good in a promotion or a new assignment because of their skill set, but you also know from a character observation point of view who has that it factor as to, the ability to just talk to people, relate to people, a caring side. And those are the things that will make a good police officer in any agency.
Dennis, I do this across the board with all of my new recruits when they get to the chief's interview or whoever I'm interviewing. And I think this also transcends into bringing females into law enforcement. But I always, I don't look for, like you had said, 6 foot tall, 250. I don't look for that. I look for a kind, compassionate, hardworking person who understands customer service, understands follow through. Those are the things I'm talking about in my chief's interview. Because at the end of the day, I can teach you to be a good police officer. I really can. I can't teach you to be a good person.
Right.
I can't teach you to have those traits. I can find those traits, and that's where I focus. The other things, it's very rare that those other things don't come into play if you have this. I'm not saying they don't, but it's much rarer than vice versa.
Yeah, I agree. Those intrinsic qualities, a person has them or they don't, and especially at that age, they're not going to develop them if they're not already formed from their earlier years. And I completely agree with those are the people that you want to draw into this profession, because more now than ever, we need people to see us as ethically minded and caring, and that we are not, what the profession's sadly been painted as, in a very broad brushed manner. So I think the more we can do things like that, of making sure we have the right people we bring on, and if we can do that and make it, expand the roles of women in law enforcement and women leadership in law enforcement, then we're going to be making some great strides.
I agree. Like I said, those are the things that I think, and again, all around, not even hiring, those are the people I want. Those are the people I want to supervise. I always tell my supervisors, those are the people you want to supervise. I want low maintenance individuals who can go out there. My goal is to treat them well in a department so they can go out and treat our community well.
Agreed, 100%. And Chief, from your perspective, there's a lot of people watching this right now because they're in a command level. Maybe they're at the beginning, middle, toward the end of their career, and maybe their final goals, they want to aspire and be the police chief of their agency or another agency. What advice do you have for the listeners and viewers out there who want to be a police chief?
So I'll start with my number one: education. And I think we've already talked about why that is so important, because of the doors that it will open and the contacts you'll have. Going off of that line a little bit, the one thing that I think is really important for administration and looking towards a police chief position is get yourself involved in boards. Be a part of the community. And a lot of times I see administrators and police chiefs, they get on boards after they become the chief. But what I found was very helpful for me is I got into those organizations prior, and I got into organizations that I cared about, that really meant something to me. But there were a couple of things that, I'll hit on why it was important. One, I built a lot of relationships out in the community, and those relationships are what is going to be pivotal as a chief, police chief, because you will not know everything. You will not know where to go, and you will need support. And it'll be those connections that you have made in those roles. So as an example, one of those boards that I sat on for a while was the Homeless Task Force. And this was prior to all of the dialogue regarding homelessness. It's always been an issue, but this is going to be around 2009, 2010 when I started to be really active in that community. And why that was important is when we started to have those issues in our community, or why I took maybe a different stance than other communities did, I had people I could go to and say, and explain why, explain this is how I was going to go to look and view it in my city. And I had that relationship where there was trust, because I had started long before. And that was invaluable. So any type of boards or community relations, do it prior to being the chief than when you become chief, because those, first of all, I've made friendships. Those relationships, sometimes I think people were surprised. They were my most vocal supporters. Sometimes even more than my staff inside. They came and they said, you know what? I don't necessarily agree with all of this, but I know her, and I think I think this could work, and it came from a good place.
Yeah, and I remember too. As chiefs, we're always busy, but I was never too busy. If someone wanted me to become on a board after I was the chief, it was always a yes, because I will find the time, because it's so critical. Because, like you said, you don't want to fix a leaking roof once it starts raining. You want to have those relationships. You want to understand the challenges, and those boards exist for reasons. And I know you are on a juvenile advocacy board. You are on homelessness boards. You are on addiction relief boards. I mean, you've done a lot, and I think hopefully the people who are watching this are thinking, what can they now do to kind of expand their relationships, and not only relationships, but it also broadens their understanding of what's going on in their communities.
I definitely had my perceptions challenged also. A lot of times I think it's important, and education does this too. community involvement does is sometimes if we are only around our tribe, and there's a lot of verses right now, and there's a lot of speaking about tribes. If you're only around one way of thinking, it is likely that's how we're designed to think one way. You need to be around people who challenge you, and it's okay. It's okay for someone to challenge what you think. You don't always have to agree. It's not a win or lose situation. And I know that that's not always the narrative right now, but we need to get back to that place where you can also be challenged and say, okay, why do I think this way? Why are these values important to me? And maybe I didn't see it from one perspective. And the only way you do that is to have someone challenge your thought process.
And again, here we are going right back to education, because what is that? It's critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and it's that self-awareness, and it's understanding you have to get out of that echo chamber, because so much of our polarization right now is because people, they don't go past what their view is, and then they associate only with those who agree with it, and that doesn't generally improve the conditions.
Well, as the example of the homeless task force, I think at the beginning, I had a lot of my peers or even my supervisors are saying, why are you going to that? I don't, we've never been invited. We don't generally go to that. Why are you going? And it was uncomfortable at first. I wasn't, I don't want to say I wasn't welcome, but I wasn't a constant there. And I said, because at some point it'll matter. And I need to have these discussions, and I need them to come to me instead of going somewhere else.
That's awesome, and fully agree with everything you just said. And in our, we have 5 minutes left, and I just want to ask a couple things. So relationship building, getting on boards, is there anything else for the prospective police chiefs that they should be doing now? Education, obviously. I've always thought that being a police chief should be a byproduct of just always working hard in whatever rank, and not aspiring that that's all you want. And if it comes naturally, then generally those are the best chiefs. But is there anything else you can think to add?
Be humble, be kind, and do it for the right reasons. Those are the things, is really focus on. I think that sometimes people get thrown into these roles, or they get these opportunities thrown at them, and they're like, of course I will take it. I think you also have to do some self-reflection of saying, why do I want to be here? Because it's a lot. It is much more than I think most people realize. And that's not a negative. But I think if you always have your why moment, then when you do have those hard times, pandemics, civil unrest, if you have your why long before that, those things are, you can move past them.
That's excellent advice, and I think no one would disagree with exactly that. And what do you think, as we close, best and worst parts of your job, best and worst parts of being the chief?
Best part, I love being the chief. I love being a police officer. I'm proud of my profession. I love the ability that I am now in a role. While I don't go out on the road, I don't do those things that I loved. I get to make sure my staff is taken care of. I really enjoy that. I really enjoy going to the budget committee, knowing that I'm going to get all external vests for them. I really enjoy that we have a brand new fleet of cars. That is great. I'm going to say I put a bow on that, because when I have the ability to do that, I feel like I've achieved them, because I know their life is better.
Right.
And they serve our community better. The worst part, and this wasn't actually hard to come to, is you're always on. There is no stopping. And even as a person, you're always on. I'm always Chief Kris or Chief Allison. I forgot where Kris went. Or when you come home and you have your children, and I need 45 minutes of just not talking because I've talked all day. And because you're always on, and there's always something to have to do over here, do here. It might not always be a crisis, but a lot of times it is. Might be a personnel issue, might be this, but you're always on.
Right. And if it's not a crisis, it's averting a crisis that's in the making. And like you said, it is a 24/7. And if it's not the things that are in the front page of the news, it's really dealing with, like you said, an internal matter, personnel matter, a string of crimes now that you have to make sure you're on top of because your community needs to feel safe. And, it is something that I think when people get into that role, they see it from a perspective that they couldn't see prior to that. And I think for those who are looking to go in it, if they just know that there is a lot more sometimes stresses and aggravation than there is glamour and glory. But like you said, those little gold nuggets of when you can get your officers good vehicles and good equipment and make their careers better, it makes it all worthwhile. And I completely relate.
Best.
Yeah. Chief Allison, thank you so much. I know Kylie's going to come in and close us out. I'm sure that the listeners and viewers were able to get a lot out of this. I really enjoyed it. So truly thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. This is another highlight, is being able to do these types of things and get other people excited about law enforcement.
Great. Awesome. Thank you both so much for your time today. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to meet the law enforcement heroes and leaders who are part of the MS-LEPSL family. If you'd like to watch previous episodes of Blue Leadership, you can find them on the videos tab of our Facebook page or by searching USD Blue Leadership on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you all next time.